This is my wrap up for the first half of Pride Month. Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome back to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thanks for spending some time with me today. So today I have my wrap up or my mid-month check-in for the first half of June, and it's been a busy month. I've finished 8 titles. Some of them were great, some not so great. And it is Pride Month, so I do try to focus on reading either books by queer authors or books with queer characters, and I kind of focus on queer literature in general, so that's not that uncommon, but I was trying to pay a little bit extra attention to it this month. And of the 8 titles I have so far, only one of them is not by a queer author or featuring queer characters, and that's actually a title that I started at the end of last month but didn't finish. So my Pride record so far is pretty strong, but that's probably going to end pretty soon for the back half of the month if my TBR is anything to be believed, but that's jumping ahead of myself. First thing I wanted to mention is that my 1-year anniversary on BookTube is coming up. That's going to be on the 1st of July, and I'm planning a 1-year anniversary video that's probably going to come out on the 30th of June. That's the day I usually release my videos, on Mondays. And I'm doing an Ask Me Anything, a Q&A video, and I have another video on my channel that I'll link to down in the description where I just explain very briefly about that and I ask for your questions. And so I'd love for you to leave your questions in the comments, ideally of that video, which I will link to, or you can leave them in the comments of this video, or you can email me. I've already received quite a number of questions in that video and also in some emails and private correspondence, but I'd love to get your questions and to make this video as robust as it can be. So thank you for your participation in that, and I look forward to it. The other thing I wanted to mention is that last week I was part of a live stream with Gareth over at Book Songs and Other Magic, and he was celebrating his 5-year BookTube anniversary, and he had a very long live stream with a bunch of other booktubers that were invited to come in, drop in and out, and spend some time together. And so I spent a little bit of time on that live stream with him, both on camera and off, and it was a lot of fun. And so I want to say thank you to Gareth and to everyone else who was part of that. It was a real fun event to be part of. And so with that said, let's get into the books that I finished so far in the first half of June. These are not in the order I read them, but just in an order that kind of makes sense to talk about them a little bit. The first one is a short story collection, and that is Dead Cowpokes Don't Wrangle, a Weird West anthology. This is edited by Mars Adler and H.S. Wolf, and this is actually an anthology that I backed on Kickstarter. And so this book was doing double duty for me. It is all queer authors writing weird West fiction, and it also is my participation in Michael K. Vaughan's event, June on the Range, which is a month dedicated to appreciating and enjoying Westerns. And this is a real fun collection. So it is all Weird West. So they take place in the West. Some of them feel like traditional Westerns, but most of them don't. They just use the West and they use some of the tropes of the Western, but they take a spin on it. So some of them have supernatural elements, some of them have vampires, some of them have horror elements, some of them have aliens. There is a lot of spice, actually far more spice than I had anticipated going into it. Some borderline smut, so that's definitely something to be aware of going into the collection that I wasn't. But overall, I had a real lot of fun with this collection. I thought the stories were diverse and interesting. I will say some of the stories could have benefited from being a little bit shorter. There are a handful that are a little bit too long. I think a little heavier hand in the editing would have been helpful. These stories were curated, but I don't think there was a singular story editor or developmental editor for all the stories. And sometimes that would be helpful in anthologies. However, with that said, I had a fun time with this collection. And in the last year, I have really enjoyed supporting anthology collections on Kickstarter. I have over a dozen, maybe 15 different anthologies that I have supported on Kickstarter. Mostly horror, queer literature, and sci-fi. There are a lot of independent authors writing in that space, and I love short story collections, and Kickstarter is a great place you can find these anthologies that are either put out by micro presses or independent presses that have authors that you've never heard of before. And you know what? Of course, and with any anthology, not every story is going to be great, but it gives you the opportunity to meet the work of a lot of different authors and artists that you would never experience otherwise. I really appreciate it. Right now, I am supporting a Kickstarter. I think it's called Nightmerica, The Corruption of the American Dream. And it's a bunch of short horror stories with that as their theme. And I don't recognize any of the authors, but the press that is putting out the anthology, I've supported them in the past and I've liked the work they put out. And so for me, Kickstarter is actually a really interesting place to support independent presses, independent artists, and especially as someone who really enjoys short stories, there is a lot of depth to be mined there. And this collection was no exception to that rule. So that was the first thing I want to talk about. Now, next, I want to talk about The White Plague by Frank Herbert. This is the book I had started last month, but I hadn't finished until the beginning of this month. And this was not great. So I had wanted to read some non-Dune Frank Herbert, and this had been recommended to me. And then I think the week or 2 weeks after it was recommended, I saw it in the used bookstore that I visit. So I thought, serendipity, I should try it. And the premise is that there's an American man, or he's Irish American, and he's a molecular biologist. And he is actually in Ireland with his family, and he has a 6-month contract to do work there. And right in their first week, as they're settling in, the IRA sets off a bomb and it kills his wife and his 2 sons, who are 5 years old. And it breaks him, basically. And he goes home and he creates this biological weapon that he unleashes, this plague. And he unleashes it specifically on Ireland and England and Libya, which are the countries he feels are most responsible. And this weapon spreads through the countries and it kills all the women in those countries. And of course, biological weapons can't be contained in any one place, so it's spreading all over the world. And the story, that all happens in the first handful of pages, right? That is, on the back cover. That's the jacket copy. And the story is him trying to come to terms with what he's done and him traveling and noticing the effect that his weapon has had on the world. So some of the chapters are from his point of view as he's traveling around. The other chapters are from the points of view of different scientists or politicians or other people. So you see the situation from both sides. That's the idea, at least. But what I'll say is, for a book this large, it's really hard to believe that this is written by Frank Herbert, because in Dune, the world building is so expansive and so engaging and enveloping. And this book, it is the opposite of that. It is quite rambling and not interested in all the things that are most interesting about this topic that he's created. If you think, if this really happened, what are the side effects? The impacts on society alone would be monumental. And these are things that Herbert touches on, but just barely. All of the most interesting ideas of what would happen if a plague like this was actually released, he kind of ignores them until the epilogue of the book. And it just feels so uninterested in the main topic that it's actually exploring. The heart of the book is this main character literally wandering around the countryside in Ireland for months. And now he's traveling with 2 other people who have met him on the road. And that's because they know who he is. The Irish government has a suspicion of who he is, but they want to make sure of it. So they have these 2 people walking and traveling with him, pretending not to know who he is. And one of them is actually the person who set off the bomb that killed his family. And why are they walking through the countryside of Ireland? I don't know. There's still cars. There's still infrastructure. It isn't like all of society has collapsed. But for some reason, they literally spend months just walking around Ireland while the scientists and while the politicians try to navigate this plague that has been created. And it doesn't go anywhere. I mean, the idea, right, is that it's some sort of inner journey, right? He comes to understand something new about himself or something, I guess, you suppose, is the idea. But it's really unsatisfying. And it was hard to finish because it was quite boring, unfortunately. So I don't recommend that. I do want to read more Frank Herbert because Dune is so spectacular. And so I have a collection of his short stories. So I think I'm going to go to that next, and before I pick up another, chunker like this. And maybe those will be more exciting for me. The next title I want to talk about is A Botanical Daughter by Noah Medlock. And I've seen a bunch of people already discuss this, and it is kind of a retake on Frankenstein. It is a queer couple living in a greenhouse in Victorian England, essentially. And one of them is a botanist, and the other is a taxidermist. And they spend all their time living in this greenhouse/laboratory, and they very rarely leave. And, obviously it isn't acceptable for them to be queer in this culture at this time. So everything is kind of secret. And the botanist has a type of fungus that seems, more reactive than other funguses. And he uses it to basically create their own daughter, right? And that's the idea of this botanical daughter. So they create new life using plant parts. So that's where it plays on this idea of Frankenstein tropes. I think it's a really interesting idea, and it's definitely weird. I like the weirdness of it. I think the writing is really nice. It moves along at a good pace, and it's just poetic enough to match the setting and the environment and do some lifting in terms of atmosphere. So I enjoyed all that. I think narratively, it just doesn't take as many risks as it could, considering how wild the premise is. It actually feels rather tame. And some of the things that happen just feel quite convenient, So I would have liked it to be bolder, actually. I did enjoy it. Like I said, I think the writing was strong, and I think the pacing was strong, and the ideas were really great. I just wished it was a little bit bolder. And I can appreciate that when you are already trying to do a retelling, it's not a retelling of Frankenstein, but it's taking this idea of creating life from nothing. When you're taking that and then putting it on a queer couple who live in a greenhouse in the middle of Victorian England, you already are, pushing boundaries. But if you're going to go there, then you need to push harder, I think, because I think the emotional depth that he wanted to bring to the story is a little bit lacking. The characters exclaim these great emotional truths, but you don't feel it in the page, right? You don't feel it in the writing. And I think part of that is because the events of the story, they happen in a very convenient manner. So there needed to be a little bit more risk taking when you got to the narrative and to actually engaging in the emotional lives of these characters, as opposed to just explaining the emotional lives to really give us a taste of them. So I enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing what else Noah Medlock writes, because it was definitely interesting and it had a lot of fun ideas. It didn't quite hit the mark as being great for me, but it's definitely fun and it's definitely worth reading if that sounds interesting to you. Another book in that same category of interesting but not great, unfortunately, is a book called This Is My Body by Lindsay King Miller. And this I actually read an advanced reader copy. This is not coming out, I think, until August, but I wanted to read it because of Pride Month. And this is a horror story that is in the subgenre of like religious horror and possession horror. The main character is a woman named Bridget, who is a lesbian, who is a single mom, and she grew up in a very strict Catholic household with her single mom and her uncle, who was a priest and who was overbearing and dominant. And she lived a life full of fear and shame, and had a very kind of religiously traumatic upbringing. And now she has her own daughter, and her own daughter, Dylan, who's 14, is going through some problems, and she believes her daughter is possessed. And this belief comes from the fact that when she was 8 or 9, she saw her uncle perform an exorcism on a 16-year-old girl, and that has stuck with her. So now she believes her daughter is possessed, and the only thing she can think of to help her daughter is to bring her daughter to her uncle, who she hasn't seen in decades. She doesn't have any other resource to turn to. So she has to go back to this place that she thought she had escaped, and the one thing she cares about most, she has to bring to that site of danger in order to try to save her. So that's all really interesting. And I will say that the take on demon possession is an interesting one. I like what she does with it. The writing is fun. I think the pacing is good. It goes back and forth between flashbacks of when she was a kid and the present day. And the writing moves the story along at a good clip. I think all of that was really well done. There's something about the character that just didn't work for me. She didn't feel genuine. And especially the first 2/3 of the book, again, they felt manufactured. They felt very convenient. The last third of the book, when things kind of go off the rails and there is, a lot more action happening, I thought that was really exciting and really well handled. The first 2/3 to get there, narratively, I thought it worked. All the different pieces felt fine, but the relationship between the mother and daughter felt forced, and they felt like it had all this tension that was only for the purpose of them being relieved later in the story. It didn't feel organic to the characters. And every decision this mother made didn't feel organic to the character as she was presented. And a big part of the story is about overcoming your own personal demons, right? Overcoming the shame and guilt that were embedded into her psyche as a result of this traumatic upbringing with this, extreme version of religion. And that is written on the page, but you don't feel it in her actions. And even when you go into the flashbacks, you don't really see this extremely traumatic experience. You see a few glimpses of it, but not enough for you to really feel, or at least for me, to really feel that it has an impact on her as an adult, right? You're told this had a huge impact on her. And in that final act, some of it comes back. But to get there, it just feels like you're being told these things. So it's much more exposition than it is demonstration. And so I had a disconnect with the main character and with the relationship between the mother and daughter in the first 2/3 of the story, unfortunately. It wasn't bad. And the writing itself, like I said, it was well written, it was well paced. I just didn't connect to the characters in a way that I really wanted to. And for something that, at least on the jacket cover, is supposedly about trauma and religious trauma, it just didn't feel like it really did that. It felt like it gave lip service to that. Last year, I read American Rapture by C.J. Lead. I think that book is a real fun example of where horror can go using traumatic religious experiences as their jumping off point. So this one missed the mark. I didn't love it, but it isn't a bad story, and it is good to have this new take on possession as part of the exorcism/possession canon. It didn't go to places I kind of expected it to, so that was fun. I always appreciate that. Now, moving into the other titles that I enjoyed a little bit more, one title I finished up right at the beginning of the month is Emily Wilde's Compendium of Last Tales by Heather Fawcett. This is the third book in the Emily Wilde series, and I think I spoke about this in my last video already, but the Emily Wilde series, I don't know how I started reading them, but I'm really glad I did. They take place in an alternative version of Victorian England where fairies and other kind of wee folk are real, and there's a whole field of academic study of people studying them, and Emily Wilde is one such professor who engages in the study of fairy and all things fae, and finds herself embroiled in all kind of fairy and fae shenanigans. And it isn't quite cozy. There is definitely some peril on the page. There is a little bit of violence on the page, especially in this third one. It's in the same neighborhood as cozy fantasy, and it is just a lot of fun to read. It's really uplifting, and there's a very good combination of peril and whimsy, and so this third book ended in a really wonderful way to end the trilogy. So if you're looking for something that is playful, is fun, has a little bit of stakes, and has some narrative thrust, but isn't going to bog you down in any way, I think this is a great trilogy. You do have to read them in order. They aren't solo books, but I think all three of them are fun. So finishing up that trilogy was an exciting thing. Now moving on to a book that wasn't quite as light or airy, I read Model Home by River Solomon, and this was phenomenal. River Solomon is an incredible author. This is the third book of theirs that I've read. I previously read An Unkindness of Ghosts, and I read Sorrowland. And An Unkindness of Ghosts is set on a spaceship, so I guess technically it's sci-fi, and Sorrowland is more speculative fiction or magical realism. And then Model Home is very firmly in the field of horror, and it is a take on a haunted house story, and one that is new and surprising. And I've read a lot of haunted house stories. Haunted house stories run the gamut, right? From having actual random ghosts in a house to a house being built on cursed ground or having some sort of generational curse, or you get to Shirley Jackson and haunted houses being a psychological metaphor. And so I've read all these haunted house stories, and this really is a new take on them. It plays with a lot of old tropes, and it goes somewhere new. I think I'm going to do a standalone review probably on this title, so I'm not going to talk too much about it. But the premise is, the main character is Ezra. They are a genderqueer single parent. They live in England, but they grew up with their two sisters in this house that is in a gated community, a very posh gated community in the suburbs of Dallas, I believe. And they're a black family, but obviously this is a very white community. So there are lots of issues of class and race and gender and all of these different kind of childhood traumatic experiences that come from the intersections of all these different identities. And the home they grew up in is haunted. It is harmful. And the inciting incident for this book is that their parents have both died in what appears to be a murder-suicide, so they all have to go home again to figure out what is going on. And they have to face their past in order to make space for a future. And it was really heart-wrenching at times. It was really hard to read at times. The writing is really beautiful. River Solomon's writing always has this poetic sensibility to it that makes it really engaging, that really pulls you in as a reader, and it brings you along for this ride. Whether this ride is based in like really gritty traumas of reality, or whether it is going into some sort of fantasy world or engaging in speculative fiction, it is a wonderful combination of both those things. And it brings in the corporeal and the psychological in the way it examines what it means to be alive in the world. So I really enjoyed this novel. I think it was great. It is a heavy book. It deals with intense topics, and it has some intense scenes, so it may not be everyone's cup of tea, but the writing alone is gorgeous. It is this combination of both devastating and affirming in a way that is hard to explain. It's devastating in its brutal honesty and not leaving any stone unturned, and being very bald-faced in the way it explores the painful realities of this family's situation. But at the same time, it is affirming because what really comes to light is the relationship these three siblings have and how powerful it is, and what the power of that relationship when they were children and now as adults, if that can sustain them, and how they can use that to sustain this grief they're feeling over their parents and as they reckon with their whole childhood. So I really, really enjoyed this story. It was intense, but I'm really glad I had a chance to read it. And there are still a few books by River Solomon I haven't read yet, but I'm looking forward to reading some more of their work. Now, continuing with intense books that are potentially a difficult read, the next title I want to talk about is You Weren't Meant to Be Human by Andrew Joseph White. And this I also read an advanced reader copy, and this isn't coming out until September. But Andrew Joseph White is quickly becoming one of my favorite authors, so I didn't want to wait. So I will have a standalone video closer to the release date. So I won't talk about this much now, except to say that, Andrew Joseph White, up until now, he has published 3 young adult novels, all horror novels, and I have loved them. I thought they've been incredible. Each of them is playing in different subgenres of horror, and they have really pushed me to understand the limits, or the lack of limits, about what YA horror can be. Because all of his novels are emotional, they're graphic, and they don't hold anything back. Nothing is sugarcoated. It is accepting the reality of being a young person and saying, these are all possibilities. These are things that young people deal with, and this is a way to explore them that is meaningful and heartfelt and isn't interested in simplifying things, right? And so I was curious as to where he could go with this, is his adult novel debut, quote unquote. And he definitely turns everything up. It's definitely intense. The premise is that it takes place in a near future, somewhat dystopian, and there's some sort of alien entity that has come to Earth. Or maybe it's always been on Earth. You don't really know. It's called the swarm. And it takes the shape of these giant piles of worms and bugs and other creepy insects that form one large, cohesive hive mind entity. And, our main character, Crane, when he graduates high school, he is thinking of taking his own life or harming himself. And the swarm intercepts him and they say, "We'll take care of you. Don't worry, we're here for you." And that's what the swarm does, is it finds people when they're at their lowest and it brings them into a family and it says, "We are here to support you, but you have to commit yourself to us. The rest of your life, you are dedicated to us." And so in that way, it feels like it could be a crime syndicate, right? Like you get inducted into the mafia. And Crane, our main character, is a autistic trans man. He's in his early 20s, and he finds out that he is pregnant and he wants to get rid of the baby. His local hive, so his branch of the swarm being the entity as a whole that's all over the world, but the local hives are the ones that you are participating in. His hive refuses to let him get rid of the baby. They say it's theirs, and they are making him take this baby to term. And it is really brutal. And I think, like I said, I'm going to do a full review of this, so I'll talk more about it in that review. The one thing I'll do here is I want to read the dedication/author's note, and I think that gives you a good sense of what this book is about. And of course, this is from the advanced reader's copy, so this is subject to change before the final print copy or publication copy. But it says, "For anyone who has ever put their face too close to the fire, or boiling water, or snapping dogs." Author's note: in addition to a graphic focus on pregnancy, miscarriage, abortion, and childbirth, You Weren't Meant to Be Human contains depictions of suicidal ideation, self-harm, violence, sex, and abuse, sometimes alone, sometimes combined, sometimes indistinguishable from one another. And so that is the kind of starting point for entry into this novel. So it's quite heavy. I did a video recently talking about why do we read difficult books? And in that video, this is one of the books I was mentioning. That right in the opening pages, there's a scene that is a sex scene that is so emotionally devastating that I had to kind of put the book down for a moment to catch a breath after reading it, because the main character's his idea of his own self-worth and his own self-esteem is so low that it was just really hard to read. But I'm really glad I read it. It's definitely the heaviest book I've read in a while. It punches the hardest, I think. One of my favorite books I've read this year, but it is a lot. But I will talk more about it in the standalone review, but that probably won't be coming until closer to the release date to help support the publication. And the final book I want to talk about today is The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin. Now, this is technically a reread. I did read this a few years ago, but to be honest, I remembered the vague outline and the plot maybe just a little bit more than what is said in the jacket copy, and there are a few scenes that I remembered, but rereading it was like reading it newly, and I'm really glad I did. I read this as part of a buddy read with Carl from Please Read Your Book, and the two of us are hopefully going to get together later this evening to talk about it, so I'm excited for that. This is a phenomenal novel. I also think I'm going to make a standalone video just on this, and I'm sure if you search YouTube, there are hundreds of videos already about this because it is such a great book, but I really, really enjoyed it. So I won't say too much about it here, but the broad overview is that this takes place on two sister worlds, one of them being Urus and one being Anaris. And the history of these worlds are such that Urus is basically very similar to Earth and very similar to Earth's population, has a number of different countries, a number of different city-states, different governments, different types of ways of being. And there was a big revolution led by a woman named Odo, and she was imprisoned for many years, imprisoned over and over again. But finally, her movement becomes so big that the government say, fine, we will give you the moon, essentially. And the moon was already colonized as a mining colony for rare earth minerals. And they said, look, we will give you the moon, and all of you revolutionaries can go to the moon, and you can live there and not bother us. So they take them up on the offer, and this story takes place about 170 years after that split has already happened. And everyone living on the moon, who call themselves Odonians, the moon being called Anaris, but they're Odonians since they follow the teachings of Odo. It is an anarchist community. And so anarchy or anarchism as a political structure is like an offshoot of socialism. Sometimes it's called libertarian socialism. So think of socialism and a socialist structure for a government entity or for a political society, and then get rid of all centralized authority and power. And that is what you have with anarchism. And Ursula K. Le Guin was famously an anarchist. So you have this anarchist society on the moon, and part of the society is they become intensely xenophobic. Part of the way they maintain their stability is by not letting anyone else move to their world, right? And they do have regular interaction with Urus. 8 times a year, a ship comes to take some of these minerals that have been mined and to bring them a few supplies that they can't get on the moon or on Neris because it's a very hard place to live. It's a very difficult environment. And so there is some communication happening, but not a lot. Our main character is a physicist named Shevik, and he is an incredible theoretical physicist, but he has hit a roadblock in his work, and a lot of his work actually is communicating with physicists on Eris. So the start of the novel is him traveling to Eris, which already is difficult. Like, people call him a traitor, and they say he can never come back. So it's this whole difficult situation, but he travels to Eris because he thinks that when he goes there, it'll allow him to complete his work and to meet other physicists who he's been communicating with and to encourage him to finish this really important work that he's doing. Yet when he gets there, he obviously realizes that things aren't like they seem, and it really is a gilded cage. And the chapters go back and forth. So the odd chapters are starting in the present and going forward, talking about Shevik on Eris, and then the even chapters are starting with his childhood and his life on Eris up to the point where he decides to leave to go to Eris. So they go back and forth in this way. And the writing is really beautiful, like always. It's really enticing. I'd say as far as Le Guin's work go, this is more of an idea book than a character book, though the character of Shevik and some of the characters around him are really well fleshed out and are really interesting. But really the story is more about ideas. And I think what I enjoyed most about it is that it isn't saccharine, and it doesn't pretend that the anarchist society is perfect and there's nothing wrong there. Part of the reason that Shevik needs to leave is because it isn't going perfectly and that there are problems in their society. And this ideal utopia that they live in, is no longer ideal. There are other things that are happening. And so he's hoping to find a way to continue the revolution, right? To make sure that he is living the revolution. But the critiques it has of capitalism and of consumption and of the way we basically live our lives, I think are really engaging and really thought-provoking. And the focus on human solidarity and on our greatest resource being each other and what we have to offer one another, I think is really enticing. And I just really enjoyed it. Like I said, I think I'm going to make a standalone video. But one thing I will say, where the title comes from, the Dispossessed, I think is really telling of the book as a whole. So this is after Shevik has gotten to the main planet, and now he's meeting with these physicists who he admires greatly, and they have challenged him and caused him to expand his understanding of physics and to, develop new theories to counteract their arguments, right? So they've been helpful to him in his theoretical exploration. And now when he meets them, he asks why there are no women around. And these incredible physicists can't even imagine that a woman could be an intellectual equal to them. On this planet, the women all play a subservient role. And this kind of blows Shevik's mind. He can't fathom that these geniuses don't have the ability to recognize women as equals. And so he says, Shevik saw that he had touched in these men an impersonal animosity that went very deep. Apparently they contained a woman, a suppressed, silenced, bestialized woman, a fury in a cage. He had no right to tease them. They knew no relation but possession. They were possessed. So the idea that everything you do in this life being filtered through the lens of what you own, what you possess, what is due to you, including your relationship with other people, especially in this case, men's relationship with women. That is how you engage in the world. That's what it means to be possessed. And so the dispossessed are those that have nothing, that claim no ownership, that claim no right of conquest. And they come with empty hands but full hearts. That's what it means to be dispossessed. That is the premise. How do those two things interact? How is someone who is dispossessed in that way bring about meaningful change to the world at large? And how can they refuse the restraints of the prisons of their own making, whether that prison be capitalism and consumption, or whether that prison be their own society where they built walls out of xenophobia, not letting others come in fear of ruining what they have? How can you break down walls for the betterment of all humankind? That is the question. And I think it's a really thoughtful book. I really enjoyed reading it, and so I'm looking forward to making a video on that as well. And that is it. Those are the 8 titles I finished the first half of June. I am currently reading a few books. I am almost done with Confess, the Autobiography by Rob Halford. Rob Halford is the lead singer of Judas Priest, who is a queer man, and you can imagine being a queer man who is also called the god of metal. That is difficult, and he was closeted for most of his life. And this is fine. I'm about 3/4 of the way done with it. I'm listening to the audiobook. It is narrated by Rob Halford himself. He does a good job of it. I'll report back at the end of the month, but it isn't mind-blowing, but it's not bad. It's fine. It's kind of what you expect. I'm also reading Some Desperate Glory by Emily Tesh. This is a buddy read with Pat. I'd wanted to do another buddy read with Pat. I really enjoyed our last one, and she suggested this this is on her list. It is a queer contemporary sci-fi novel, so it goes in theme with Pride Month reading, but also in Pat's interest in reading more contemporary sci-fi as well. I think this is actually an interesting story and an interesting twist on, dystopian sci-fi. So the premise is that there's a giant war between humans and these other alien races, collectively called the Majo, and Earth was destroyed and billions of lives lost. But there's one small enclave of humans that never gave up fighting, and they are humans' last great hope. And our main character is born into this community that live basically on a space station. And it's a very small community. They're raised as part of this kind of military encampment. And when you're 17 is when you are given an adult assignment, either as a warrior or as a maintenance person, making sure that the space station continues to run, or as a breeder, because you need to make sure that the human population continues to grow. And so our main character is 17, and she is awaiting what her assignment is going to be. And now, meanwhile, our main character has a twin brother who is also being assigned at this time, and he all of a sudden disappears. He's no longer on the space station. So she decides that instead of letting him be considered a traitor, she's going to go find him. And there are still humans that exist in the universe, but they're all considered traitors, people that have gone over to the side of the aliens, that don't care about humanity anymore. So when she leaves the space station to go find her brother, she is also labeled as a traitor, someone who has given up the cause. In her mind, what she is really doing is the best thing she can to support the cause by going to find her brother, who is an incredible warrior, and to bring him back to the space station to make things right again. And that is the starting point of the story. You find out things aren't really as she understands them to be, and the state of the world isn't as it was taught to her as a child. And so she is going through her own personal exploration of what she's been taught and what her experiences are in the real world. So I'll leave it at that. I am halfway through right now, and Pat and I are meeting hopefully later today. By the time this video airs, we'll have already met for our first time, hopefully, and to discuss it. And then hopefully we'll finish it next week, and then we'll have another discussion next week to wrap it up. I'm looking forward to my discussion with Pat. The book is interesting. It has some fun ideas. I'm not loving it, but there are some things I think that it's doing well. So we'll see how it goes on. And I'm sure I'll have more to say about it in my monthly wrap up. So that's it. That is what I've been up to the last 2 weeks. Finished 8 titles. Some of them were quite good. Model Home and You Weren't Meant to Be Human and The Dispossessed were all 5-star reads. Really some of the best books I've read this year. Emily Wilde's Compendium of Lost Tales also up there. Not quite as good as those 3 for me, but a lot of fun. And the others, of varying quality or various levels of enjoyment, but I'm glad I read all of them. Now, what do I have coming up for the back half of June? Well, like I said, in terms of videos, I do hope to do a review of Model Home and maybe a review of The Dispossessed. And then at the end of the month, I'll have my 1-year BookTube anniversary. So again, if you have questions, please leave them in the comments below or look down in the description and find a link to the video where I talk about this more, and you can leave a comment there as well. So those are coming up for videos. For reading, I have a pretty ambitious TBR. I don't know if I'll get to all of them, and that's okay if I don't, but I'm going to try to. So the first thing, I recently saw this at a used bookstore, and this is Incarnations by Clive Barker. It's 3 plays. Now, I didn't know that Clive Barker had written any plays, so when I saw this, I couldn't help but grab it, and I'm really excited to try to get to it. And generally, plays read pretty quickly, so even though it is a little bit hefty, I think I'll get through this soon. And then next, I'm hoping to read Ocean Vuong's new book, Emperor of Gladness. I talked about this a little bit in a previous video. This just came out last month and is kind of a follow-up or a kind of a spiritual successor to On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. So I'm looking forward to reading this. And then moving into kind of my comfort territory, picking up some series that I want to finish and some rereads that I kind of want to do for myself. So I'm hoping to finish up the Children of Time series with Children of Memory. Well, of course, as I mentioned, this will finish the first trilogy. There's a new book coming next year, so it won't finish the series entirely, but this is on my very imminent TBR. And then I want to reread The Outsider by Stephen King. I recently read his newest book, Never Flinch, which is the 4th Holly Gibney novel. And this is really the first Holly Gibney novel, or it's considered the first, even though she first appeared in the trilogy, the Bill Hodges trilogy. And I really loved this novel, and I think of the 4 Holly Gibney stories, 3 novels and 1 novella, this might be my favorite, so I want to reread it to see if I still think that. I have another Adrian Tchaikovsky title I want to read this month. That's Cage of Souls, so we'll see if I can get to it, but I'm really hoping to catch up on Tchaikovsky's whole catalog, basically. More than 1 a month is kind of my goal right now, so we'll see if I get to this. And now last month, I did finish the Live Ship Traders trilogy. That is the 2nd sub-series in the Realm of the Elderlings saga, which is a 16-book saga by Robin Hobb. So having finished that, and I did a review for that whole trilogy that came out last week on my channel. The next trilogy is called the Tawny Man trilogy, and the first book is called Fool's Errand. So I'm hoping to read this month as well. I'm really excited to. I really loved the Lives of Traitors trilogy. I think I liked it more than the Farseer trilogy. So I'm looking forward, though, to getting back to Fitz and to seeing what he's up to. And then I have another short story collection that I've been meaning to read for quite a long time. This is In the Mad Mountains, Stories Inspired by H.P. Lovecraft. This is by Joe Lansdale. And then the other thing on my agenda for this month, and this is actually, of all of these books that I've mentioned, probably the only one that's guaranteed and the one that is least expected, A Wizard of Earthsea. And that is the first book in the Earthsea cycle by Ursula K. Le Guin. And this is her YA fantasy cycle that now has 6 novels. This book contains the first 4 novels, and Wizard of Earthsea is the first of those 4. And I had been planning on reading this like conceptually, but the reason I'm reading it now is in that 5-year BookTube anniversary video, this book came up, and Richard from Vintage SF mentioned that the audiobook narrated by Harlan Ellison is a really wonderful one to read, and that I noticed was available at my library, and I requested it, and the hold just came in yesterday. So that means I have 2 weeks before that hold disappears. So I'm definitely going to be reading it, and whether I continue with the Earthsea cycle right now or whether I put it off and read some of the other books later, I don't know, but I'm definitely going to read that first one, thanks to the fact that the specific audiobook, there's multiple versions of that audiobook, but the one narrated by Harlan Ellison was recommended, and since I was able to get it, I'm excited to give that a try as well. So that is what is on my agenda. It is ambitious. I don't think I'll get through all of them, but at least I have a roadmap, and so we'll see how the rest of the month works out. And that's all I have for you guys today. I really appreciate you spending some time with me. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments about any of the books I have read or any of the books I am going to read or any other suggestions you might have. And again, if you have any questions for my 1-year anniversary Ask Me Anything, please leave them down in the comments below or see that other video and leave them there. Or you can always drop me an email if you prefer. But with that, I'll say thank you for spending some time with me today. I appreciate you. Please be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.